Well, let's turn our attention to wealth. You heard in the headlines, King Charles, multi-millionaire, has asked for a surge in profits from the Crown estate in offshore wind farms to be used for what he called the wider public good. So it would mean that some money set aside for the sovereign grant. You can see here the headline in the Times, King's Crown estate wind farm to generate £1 billion for Britain. It would be set aside normally for the sovereign grant, which runs the royal household. But in this case, he's suggesting it be retained by the Treasury and can be used for public spending. So, should the rest of the rich be doing something similar? What do you make of the King's decision and announcement today? A good?
Oh, it's very generous of him. I wish I had £1 billion I could donate away and be able to afford. But it's not enough. It's not enough. In the last 3 years, the government's given out £700 billion. That would be enough to give £14,000 to every single adult in the country. Now, if you're going to give out that amount of money, you need to do an analysis of where that money's going to end up. You have to. And at the beginning of COVID, I was screaming out, let's do an analysis of who's going to end up with the £700 billion. The Conservatives didn't do it, Labour didn't do it, the BBC didn't do it. So I did it, and what I found out was that money was going to overwhelmingly end up with the richest people in society. That's enough money to give the richest 5 million adults in this country £140,000 each.
Now, you were a millionaire. You earned £1 million in your first 2 years, you say, as a trader. You've changed your mind about how the world should work, how capitalism should work in the UK. What sort of triggered your Damascene conversion?
The way I became a millionaire is after the 2008 crisis, I realised that because of a massive growth in inequality, we would basically never come out of that crisis. And I started to put massive bets on that the economy would get worse and worse and worse. And within a year of doing that, I became Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. So, if your job is to look at the economy and analyse it, and your analysis is the economy is going to get worse and worse because of inequality, and then you are judged to be the best trader in the world, I think you have a responsibility to do something about it.
Cynics would say that's after you earned all that money. That's
well, I was 24,
light.
You have to give me a bit of time.
What do you think, Annabelle, about the thesis being put forward by Gary in order to tackle growing inequality as he sees it?
Well, I think inequality is very difficult to measure, and there are massive fluctuations. So if you look at something like the Sunday Times Rich List, it's not the same names that are there year in, year out. Wealth is accumulated over time, so you can end up in a situation where if you've had a very low birth year, actually, 20 years later, inequality has gone down. But that's not necessarily due to the society becoming more equal or any policies that the government has introduced. I mean, look, I think everybody is uncomfortable to varying degrees with inequality, the idea that you have billionaires out there in possession of super yachts, whereas there are some people who are struggling to get by in the world on $2 a day. But the question is, what policies can you implement? I mean, it's virtually impossible to have some kind of wealth tax at a global level. How would you assess that? And once you'd assessed it, let's say that's possible, how on earth would you redistribute it? And at the national level, implementation really isn't any easier. To even assess people's wealth would be very difficult. It would be very invasive. I think it would throw up all sorts of concerns around property rights. This is, let's not forget, money that has been taxed on acquisition that you are then looking at taxing further.
Well, what are the policies, Gary? What would you do?
Lots of things are difficult, but some things are important, OK? If you give out £700 billion, you need to know where that money's gone to. OK, if you're giving hundreds of thousands of pounds to the richest people in the country, you have to expect inflation, a cost of living crisis for ordinary people. Listen, we increased inequality at the fastest rate in the history of this country during a time when the economy was closed. You are making ordinary families poorer. That is the cause of this crisis.
But
if you don't fix it...
Just to explain, you're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds being handed out during the pandemic, in part, so during the furlough scheme. The argument from the government, and I'll let Nikki and Angela in a moment, was that it kept people's jobs. It paid people's wages. What were they to do instead?
You do the analysis where the money will end up. Listen, I was there. I'm an inequality economist. I wanted to know where does it end up. OK, the money goes to furloughed workers. It's £14,000 per adult. Do you think furloughed workers are £14,000 richer? They're not, because they weren't getting their wages. OK, well, who's got the wages? The corporations. Well, were the corporations richer? In general, not, because they were closed. Who's got the money? The customers. But not all customers, because it was only luxury, non-essential spending that stopped during COVID.
Nikki, do you want to defend furlough and the decisions made by the government during that time? Of course, there are lots of allegations about billions being wasted.
Just to be clear, I'm not against furlough. What I'm against is not analysing where the money ended up and not doing anything about it accumulating with the richest people in society.
Well, they would say there wasn't enough time to do it. But Nikki?
Well, look, I think, we had to act at the time. We were in, the once-in-a-100-year pandemic. We spent £400 billion. That's now got to be paid back, and that's part of...
But who's got the money now?
So let's look at... You say that you want to tax more of the wealthy. Well, let's look at the facts. Now, the top 1% of taxpayers now contribute 30% to the Treasury.
And are the top 1% of taxpayers the richest people?
In the last Labour government under Gordon Brown, it was 24%. So there is an increase in the wealthy paying more tax to
taxpayers
the
are not I pay tax.
I pay tax.
Yeah, exactly. Working people pay tax. The wealthiest people don't pay tax. They pay much, much lower rates of tax.
Right, and why is that? Is that because they can afford to move their money elsewhere? Is it because they can afford to leave the country?
You know what? I might question it's partially because we have a Prime Minister whose father-in-law is one of the richest men in the world. We have a previous Prime Minister who went on to make millions of pounds as soon as he left office. David Cameron made £10 million in a year of leaving office. If you put tax decisions in the hands of people who are extremely rich or about to become extremely rich, do you think they will say, let's tax extremely rich people?
All right, Nikki?
I think that's such a cheap shot. Keep throwing at the Prime Minister. He comes from the background he comes from. He's worked hard, like you, in the city, and he's made his contribution.
And he's presided over the biggest increase in inequality in the history of the country.
Gary, I can see your point that we tax income and wealth differently, and this is potentially problematic. But I still am a little bit unclear as to what your solution is. And let's not forget, let's look at the example of France, where Mitterrand introduced the wealth tax in 1982, and it was a failure. It turned out that it brought in around half as much as it cost. So even if you accept the thesis, what's the solution?
Right.
I mean, firstly, the Treasury Select Committee, which has a Tory majority on it, recently looked at the tax system and did not rule out a wealth tax.
Is Labour going to...
Well, it's not our policy to have a wealth tax.
No.
It's our policy
Why
to
not?
have... Listen, let me finish.
I will.
You've not let me in, and now you won't let me finish a sentence.
No, Angela, you are part of the conversation.
Thank you. That's very good to know. The Treasury Select Committee pointed out how difficult it is to do wealth taxes in anything other than a one-off way, because people move their money around and you've got to have international agreements to do it, because capital and wealth is so mobile at the moment. But let's look at the situation. Since the pandemic started, the richest 1% have pocketed 26 trillion of the wealth that has been generated in the world. Now, that is not a sustainable position for humankind. It's not socially sustainable. It's actually not economically sustainable. So we have to move to a world where there are fairer tax systems and more redistribution to people who currently are at work and are not earning enough to live on, to get by on, who are working and have to go to food banks, who are right at the front end of the cost of living crisis. Socially, you cannot deal with that. Now, even the IMF now says that we have to have what it calls inclusive growth. That means environmentally and socially sustainable. To do that, we have to have a fairer tax system which takes more money off people who are doing very, very well and redistributes it to the people whose work is the lifeblood of the economy. And that is the values that the Labour Party has.
They're the values, but what are the policies that Labour would put in place to get back some of that money that you've talked about? You've talked about non-dom status.
Let's take another example. A windfall tax, for example. If you look at the windfall profits of the energy companies at the moment, the current windfall tax that Rishi Sunak has introduced isn't even raising very much money at all, because there's big offsets for investment allowances. So we've got to have a more effective windfall tax to do with some of the undeserved and unexpected profits that corporations are making. There are many, many things you can do to generate money that you can then use to put into the productive areas of the economy, to make the move, for example, to net zero carbon, to do some of the transformations that we need in our infrastructure.
All right, well, let Nikki respond.
Well, we can't do any of that if we continue to take money out off companies. If we give them tax breaks for investment, so they are investing back into the infrastructure, that's going to create more jobs. It's then going to create more tax receipts. that's the way to do it.
Well, by the way, it might help if we didn't have an ex-chancellor who's been chased around by the...
Oh, well, we'll come to that. We'll come to Nadeem Zahawi.
And has to pay his back taxes because he's been trying to avoid paying them.
All right, but let's get back to the idea about how you actually get this wealth back.
Yeah.
We've set out some of the issues, or rather you have, but how do you do it? How do you actually put in place wealth taxes that Annabelle says doesn't work? Labour, Angela says, aren't really looking at a wealth tax. So assets like property, it doesn't look as if they're going to be part of the picture, partly, maybe rightly or wrongly, but they're not going to be part of it. In the Daily Telegraph, the entrepreneur businessman James Dyson, also a millionaire, stupid, short-sighted Tory policies are holding back the economy, criticising the burden of regulations, increasing tax on companies that he says will cost you dear at the ballot box. Is he right?
Look, I think we've got to... Look, I'm a low-tax, small-state Conservative, and I want to see tax cuts. And, you know...
Well,
they're
not coming, are they?
Well, let's see what's happened. Let's see what happens in the budget. Let's see what happens in the next budget.
No.
You know, we've got to move move our growth agenda on, of course, but we've also got to ensure that we pay for COVID, we pay for the cost of living, and we ensure that we pay for the war that's in Ukraine.
What do you say to James Dyson? I mean, he is a wealth creator, he would say, and he doesn't want regulation and high taxes in order to create jobs and pay those people.
Well, I've never met James Dyson. He might be a very nice guy.
I haven't
but
either.
He's a very wealthy person, and he doesn't want tax on the very wealthy. I don't think I need to say more than that. But what I'm saying is, what I'm seeing from this discussion is a government that's given out £700 billion and has done no analysis of where the money's gone.
Well, you've said that, but that's the kind of...
You don't even know who's got the money now.
But you left your job in the city trading in 2014. Yes. More broadly speaking, what is the answer? What are the policies that either Labour or Conservatives could do that would actually bring back some of the wealth from the super rich, if we're going to call them that, and redistribute it?
There are some low-hanging fruit which should obviously be done. You should equate capital gains with income tax. There's no reason why the wealthy pay less on that rate. You should close the loopholes, obviously, but you need to bring in something that will transfer that wealth back. If you are willing to give £700 billion to the richest and do nothing to bring it back, then ordinary families pay the price. So you need to bring in serious moves to redistribute.
You've also got to deal with offshore tax evasions. You've got to deal with these packages of offshore companies that allow people to export their money and avoid paying taxes.
Yeah.
You've got to deal with profit shifting in global multinational corporations. Some of this has got to be done by international agreement. But the fact is, as Thomas Piketty, the economist, says, we're now in a situation where the wealthy are going to get more and more wealthy, and wealth is actually going to accumulate without stopping because growth levels are lower than the amount of money you can get on your wealth in interest. So what's happening is that the billionaires index, the Bloomberg billionaires index, has to be updated every day.
Well, I mean, Annabelle, isn't there...
Global billionaires' wealth is rising so much it's obscene, and we need to, as a global international community of politicians and economists, do something about it.
Right, well, hang on. Let me bring in Annabelle on this, because, you know, the idea of trickle-down economics, this idea that you allow the most wealthy, or certainly some of them, to spread that wealth, and they're encouraged to do so. It didn't work broadly, did it, under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which was seen as an example of that trickle-down economics?
Mistakenly seen as an example of trickle-down economics. That's a fallacy. I don't think any economist, certainly not any free market economist, has ever used the expression trickle-down economics. The idea seems to be that if you, grow the pie, the wealthy get richer, they spend more in the economy, and that wealth gets transferred to the poorest in society. Well, if that were true, then you would simply strip the assets of the rich and give them to the poor. Why not just cut out the middleman? Why incentivise them, or take the money, incentivise them to go and spend in the economy? I think what concerns me about this discussion...
IEA's dogma, economic
I don't believe there's a single piece of research, publication, blog, article that a single member of the IEA or anyone associated with us has ever mentioned the term trickle-down economics.
Don't talk over each other.
A concern that I do have is that so much of the debate now around improving the lives of the poorest seems to be fixated on the wealthiest. How do we implement punitive taxes on billionaires?
Well, it's the inequality, isn't it? The gap between the wealthy.
But I'm reasonably relaxed about inequality. Of course, I don't like the idea that... Let me finish. Hang on. It's important you let me finish this.
Finish the sentence.
I don't like the idea, of course, that you have billionaires with super yachts and you have people who are living on $2 a day in this world. I don't think anybody is comfortable with that. However, if the lives of the poorest are being improved, continually improved, then even if the super rich are getting richer, you're still seeing improvements in the quality of life of the poorest in society.
Is that true?
So it's not
For me, this is not about inequality. This is about living standards of the ordinary people of this country. If you give £700 billion to the richest people in the country when the economy is closed, they will spend that money, drive up prices, and ordinary families increasingly will not be able to afford the basics like food and energy. Listen, if you give this money to the rich, it affects ordinary people.
So what is your solution?
A wealth tax in full spending. Listen,
but would you not accept that all of the downsides to wealth taxes, the fact that they've almost everywhere that they've been tried, they've subsequently been reversed?
You're talking to somebody who has made
worked.
millions of pounds by betting that the economy will collapse every single year, OK? And I'm betting on that right now, and I don't want it to happen. If you do nothing about growing inequality, if you don't do anything about growing inequality, poverty will get worse and worse and worse. And I'm telling you now, listen, in a few years' time, when it happens, when things are worse, remember this day.
It's not
and you can't say you didn't know about it.
sustainable